Video game development is like pizza. I don't actually have any evidence or something like that for this claim, but I'm bad with starting things. Bioshock Infinite is my favorite game, and I love talking about it. From the story to the characters, and even the gameplay, I can go on and on about it. But I'm not here to talk about that. There's tons of other video essays about the story and how it all holds up and what could have been done better or even worse. What I want to talk about is the development history for this game. It's pretty nuts, and for those old enough to remember, this game changed every time it was shown. Before we begin, let's set down a couple things. First off, this video has spoilers. If you haven't played the game before, please go play it. In fact, go play all 3 Bioshock games. They are fantastic and worth the money, and they're even in a little bundle to buy. Second, there's a lot of things that didn't make it past the concept art phase. Just because you see it here doesn't mean it was cut content, since it never turned into content. Thirdly, just keep in the back of your mind the dates we cover and the state of video game design at the time. I'll talk about this at the end. With that said, let's begin. The easiest way to talk through the development is by creating a timeline with key points, and then we'll fill in the blanks. We start in either August 2007 or February 2008. Kind of a wide margin, but I've seen evidence for both dates. Bioshock Infinite begins development, codenamed as Project Icarus. Initial plans for the game would follow the downfall of Rapture through the civil war between Fontaine and Ryan. Feeling this would ruin the mystique of the original game, they quickly dropped the idea for something during the Renaissance period. This also got dropped once Assassin's Creed 2 was announced. Eventually, they decided on placing the game in the sky. When deciding the style of the city, they decided to go with a more Art Nouveau style. Quite literally because Rapture was an Art Deco style. Due to the difficulty and expense Art Nouveau would cause, they quickly changed art direction for a more neoclassical style.
When we first did City in the Sky, we first decided we were going to do City in the Sky, we said, hey, Art Deco worked really well for us in Bioshock 1, let's do Art Nouveau, because it has the word art in it. Art Nouveau is so difficult to work with in a game world because where Art Deco is full of nice, solid shapes that are really, like, you can make something Art Deco and it's automatically low poly and fits into a game budget perfectly just because of its large shapes, large simple shapes. Where Art Nouveau is very swirly and very fine-tuned and based on animals and plants, and you try to make a polygon out of that and it's like your budget's blown.
There isn't much footage during the Art Nouveau period, but there sure is plenty of art. The only footage we reliably have is showing off the original Elizabeth, referred to as the Gibson Girl. Let's take a look at this footage. We start with a view of the city and the current UI. Health is in the top left with vigors on the bottom left, and then the gun/ammo icons in the bottom right. We get a view of some buildings and see how dark and fucked the sky seems to be. The camera suddenly turns around, showing the Gibson Girl turned us. She points to some robot in the distance and the footage ends. The initial plan was to have our player character and the Gibson Girl be mute, with the only interaction being the girl pointing to things or trying to get our attention to something. This quickly got dropped.
I think the reason Liz originally didn't speak is just because it was anxiety on our part about being able to, the ambition of trying to make her work in all the ways we wanted to make her work, and that would be easier than having her talk. We weren't going to have the player speak either, so this whole notion of a conversation between a first-person player character and a third-person character, it's just not, there's not a lot of great examples of that really working, and so I think we were just had a little stage fright.
Well, I guess our philosophy for Elizabeth early in the development side was quite different from where we ended up, right? We started out trying to make her a scripted mute, and I say scripted in the sense that we would have our designers script every moment of her work. It just wasn't as interesting or as fascinating to the player as what we wanted it to be. So we sort of rolled into a more systemic end, with still some scripted parts to her behavior, and a lot of handcrafted work in there too, but giving her the opportunities to do things in the world where we couldn't have done with a scripted setup.
The amount of information that you need to get across to the player, even all the stuff that as an animator I don't even have to deal with. Look over there. Let's go this way. I think the thing is up here on the balcony, and I think about if she couldn't talk, if she couldn't say these things or even allow for some of this story to take place while you're exploring the area. Hey, I'm opening these crates now. I'm searching for some more salt, but she's telling me a little history of the Hall of Heroes. The experience gets richer because she has that knowledge that she can push on you. And if she was mute, I think that you would miss a lot of that stuff. I'm not saying it can't be done, it'd just be a different story. You would be more focused on the visuals of what she was doing because she would need to be on screen for her to have any meaningful impact. Whereas a Liz that can talk doesn't have to be on screen. The player has much more freedom to look around and be their own speed, but still be aware of her presence and understand what she's doing. That early test, the one where she grabs the player forcibly and points, it was some giant mechanical doll that we had at the time. I realized, as a gamer, I don't want Liz grabbing me every 5 seconds to, grab the controller out of my hand and force me to look in a direction. That should be player choice. So those are other factors involved in not only giving Liz a personality, but gameplay issues of how often do we want the player to physically have to have Elizabeth on screen when they're dealing with looting and combat and all the other things that you're doing in a first-person shooter.
The most important part of this footage, though, is the mechanical being we see. This was meant to be an early enemy we'd face that even had alternate designs planned. These would be made by an enemy called the Mad Toy Maker, who I believe would have been a central enemy in the game. There's actually quite a few enemies that were designed by this guy. The first would be a mechanical watchman that watched the streets, one that even looks like it would have functioned like an early camera or alert system. There's 2 different rabbit-style designs, one that looks like a ringleader with a top hat, the other looks like an Easter bunny that probably threw eggs at the player. There's a night-themed owl with blades above his hands, a bipedal elephant that has a cannon on his back that would fire with the pull of a string. The last one is the most important. This machine is called the Mothman. Designed to be a signature flying enemy in a flying city using the butterflies commonly used in Art Nouveau. The Mothman clearly looks similar to a Big Daddy, and has the most art out of most enemies in this period. As they moved away from the Art Nouveau style, the Mothmen started receiving different looks. Some were just flying Big Daddies, but others were more like mechanized flying chimeras. In case you couldn't tell already, this enemy would eventually evolve into the Songbird. I'll just talk about that here, since the next game footage shown has the full design of the Songbird. Designs moved from chimera to more of a dragon, or just like a person in the sky. Eventually, they landed on the bird-like look in the final design. Interestingly enough, there's actually artwork detailing how Songbird's wings look. The art book also has one of my favorite arts of Songbird, showing how terrifying it would be to face for a regular human. Now enough about the Mad Toy Maker and his designs. Let's look at other enemies that never really made it past the concept art phase. First up is probably the second most grotesque design I've seen for this game. Some body horror ahead for those that get squeamish. This version of enemies would start out as regular humans with a desire to eat human flesh. Upon consuming flesh, they would grow to a monstrous size with some fucked up features. The most popular one is Shelly, who has a cage on her head to stop her from easily eating. Once more of the central themes of the game were decided on, these enemies were quickly dropped. The next enemy is a bishop or pope-looking human named the Resurrector. This enemy would be able to manipulate the dead, an idea that gets added to an enemy we'll talk about later on. The next 2 design types I believe would eventually turn into the Handyman. The first is an enemy with a giant turbine on his back that would generate electricity to shoot out of his fingertips. The other is a human with a giant crab-like contraption on him. As displayed in the art, he would grab people and tear them in half. The last enemy we'll talk about for now are the Theater Magicians, occult-like enemies that would be able to use telekinesis. The art book also says they'd be able to make minions, but I couldn't find any art for this. In terms of non-enemies, the game would feature automaton gentlemen. They would have been closer to servants, and I personally believe they started out as a base for the eventual motorized patriots in the final game. One last tiny thing about the gentlemen is this concept art. It says how automatons became more than just machines. I didn't see anything about this outside this art piece, but it's interesting nonetheless. At this point in time, the developers were also looking at how to add plasmids into the game. They were literally called plasmids, according to the early art. Before deciding on the drink version, they would still be injections, but the player would have used a little machine. One design has a hose going into a hand, while the other is just a needle attached to the device. We now jump ahead to August 12th, 2010. The announcement trailer for Project Icarus is released, showing the official title Bioshock Infinite. There's actually a little bit to talk about here. After the Rapture fake-out, we see our first hint at the Handyman. The hand, feet, and heart look similar to the final game's version. As the design at this point does not change much from the final one, let's talk about the concept art. The arms and legs don't change all that much, but the same can't be said for the body and head. For his body, initially his internal organs were visible. His torso would be a green, see-through container. His head was also covered with a mask. The final design removed the mask and scarred up his face while his body is entirely covered except for where his heart is. We get a good look at the city around and see it's far brighter and vibrant compared to the dark sky in the test footage. A small detail I noticed is the difference in how the floating city works. In this trailer, we see a city segment rise higher due to the more flames and the balloons underneath. In the final game, Elizabeth makes a comment about how the city is stuck in the air due to quantum levitation technology.
I just realized who those two are. They, well, at least she, invented the technology that allows the city to float.
Giant balloons.
Quantum particles, suspended in space-time at a fixed height.
So, not giant balloons?
Lastly, we see Elizabeth, looking far different than her initial Gibson Girl variant. We get to see her current powers that are more magical than the final version. Now, Elizabeth gets more design changes by the end of the game, so we'll cover that more later. The same goes for her powers. Oh, also the first we ever see of Booker is him drowning. If you know, then you know. A couple of months pass, and it's the E3 season. You know, back when that was a thing. The date is roughly September 22nd, 2010. Bioshock Infinite gets its first gameplay demo, and whoo boy is there a lot to go over. We open on a mural that seems to inspire the one we see upon entering Columbia in the final game. Next, as we walk through the streets, there's a couple things. The mechanical horse-drawn carriage is some different coloring than the final version. There's a lady cleaning a porch while the store is on fire. We see the same thing in the base game, but the lady is vanishing in and out of reality. Lastly is a giant statue of a lady that turns into the statue of Monument Island in the final game. Booker walks up to an archway with a poster supporting a politician named Saltonstall. We actually are about to see him in the demo, but he never makes it completely into the final game. At most, you can see his scalp on a Vox board. Before talking to Saltonstall, Booker looks at the various propaganda signs that don't make it into the final game. The sniper rifle that gets grabbed here looks almost exactly like in the base game. The only difference is how shiny it is and the cocking animation after firing. Our first big thing that lets me yap a lot is when Saltonstall shimmers. In the base game, characters do this when stuck in between worlds. While similar here, it was meant to be one of the merged. Before I explain, I want to give a giant content warning for this next section. While it's all concept art, it's pretty gruesome body horror. Initially, tears weren't something Elizabeth would make, but something that would randomly appear. Anyone could interact with the tears and see into other dimensions. Columbia citizens would peer into these tears and see their alternate universe lives. In the worst case scenario, though, some would merge with their other selves to horrifying effects. While this idea never made it into the final game, I believe Saltonstall was meant to either be under this effect without the visual clues, or more like characters that phase in and out in the final game. Next up, we get to see our first vigor, Murder of Crows. Fun fact, this is actually my favorite vigor. Booker then either uses the charge vigor, or at this point in development, there was an attack that you could do that was similar. I'll end up talking more about vigors and how they were either cut or changed later on in the video. We see an early version of the skylines, and more interestingly, we see the floating buildings go up and down. Just an interesting detail, since they mostly stay static in the final game. Booker uses a telekinesis vigor that didn't make it very far into development. At this point, we see they've decided on drinkable vigors and the post-drink effects. We see Saltonstall fire a mortar cannon that I couldn't find any hint of in the base game. It seems like it got converted into the mortar gun. Next up is our first time seeing the skyhook. It's just a little guy that unfurls in our hand. It's kind of crazy seeing how different it used to look. While we're here talking about this, there was also concept art for the end skyhook being able to sort of extend. We also see the sky rails for the first time, and they kind of look more like a conveyor belt than, you know, the metal on train tracks style of the final game. One more quick thing is the wrench melee weapon that got cut. The only time we ever see it is here when Booker uses it on the sky rail. Next up is the famous bar scene. The most notable part here is when Booker makes the shotgun shoot its owner. While it does look like Booker is using the telekinesis figure for this section, I think he also uses another one. It's called Weapon Slave. The idea is that the user summons a ghost to use the gun on your enemies, kinda like creating a companion. It seems this footage was predating the ghost, so it looks like telekinesis. While Weapon Slave didn't make it into the game as a vigor, it did make it in as one of the equipable clothing gear. The telekinesis in the next part is cool and makes me wish we could do something like that in that base game. We now jump ahead 20 or so seconds and see our first shock jockey. I wish this mob of enemies also existed in the final game. A wild Elizabeth appears, sporting her endgame attire and a wildly different power set than in the finished product. You can actually see this model of Elizabeth in the final moments of the campaign. At this time, her powers were not alternate universe based. They're closer to magic, or even someone using a ton of vigors or plasmids. Personally, I think the idea for laying vigor traps and then using another vigor to combo with them came from this early footage with Elizabeth's powers. You might notice that the weather and sky turns closer to how it was in the test footage. This footage actually helped them realize that Infinite was just closer to Bioshock in the sky.
Other thing we did fairly early on was dark and stormy, lots of clouds, really pushing in the cloud cover so you feel a bit claustrophobic. Even down to the point where we're lighting it the same way that we're lighting Rapture. We realize that, you know, we're doing a city in the sky, but we're really just doing Rapture again. Like, there's no wow moment. There's no like, wow, I really feel like the expanse of the sky. I feel claustrophobic. I don't feel like there's this wide open space. So you have to take a good hard look at where you come from and where you're going, and if you really think that you're pushing it far enough.
That's why the final game ends up way brighter until pretty much the end of the game. I also like how Elizabeth takes a bit more agency in combat. I get it works easier for scripted sequences like in combat, but in the final game she mostly follows your command with the occasional refill if you need it. Elizabeth also gets hurt from using her abilities. This idea sorta makes it into the next footage we'll watch, but gets completely dropped for the final product. Next up is the Handyman fight. He's got no mask, but doesn't have the scarred up look he eventually has. This model actually also never made it to the endgame. Well, sort of. You're able to see it in one small section. There's some more interaction with the environment that gets mostly cut. The only remnants are explosive barrels or similar explosive things. The last bit is Songbird, otherwise known as him in the trailer. Take a look at the dialogue here.
3 cheers for us, eh?
That was the one who was chasing you, right?
No, that wasn't him. That wasn't him. That's him!
Booker asks if the handyman was the person chasing Elizabeth. This shows it's Booker's first time seeing a handyman and that Booker likely didn't free Elizabeth from Monument Island. Or at least, Songbird didn't arrive when Booker freed her. This would also probably be an hour or two into the game then. And that's the end of the first official gameplay we ever got. Before we move on to the next footage, we got a little bit more to talk about. At this point in time, there were 2 multiplayer modes in development. One was called Border Control. You and another person would be in a tower defense style mode where you would kill stereotypes of old political cartoons. The other, bigger mode was Spec Ops. You would team up with 3 other people in a roguelike mode where areas and loot would be randomly generated. You'd use the loot to upgrade your characters, and as time went on, it would tell the story of a Vox versus Founders war. Jumping ahead in the timeline, by the time the mode was cancelled in 2012, only one map was close to being released, a museum level. There's actually a surprising amount of art for this mode we found, and even some UI screens in the game files I'll show you later. We now move to E3 2011 with a new gameplay showcase. The footage starts with Booker and Elizabeth entering a shop. Elizabeth is wearing the corset with short hair, meaning this section is either later on in the game, or she was only ever in this outfit at this point of development. Nolan North and Courtney Draper have also become the voices of Booker and Elizabeth. The first important thing we see is a poster for Zachary Hale Comstock. At this point in development, his design was of a younger politician as opposed to an old man. Funny enough, he's got an even earlier design where he looks like a sleazeball. Booker then picks up Bucky Bronco, but no animation for the first time drinking. We see in a second he also picks up a pistol, and since there's no other UI for a backup vigor or gun, I'm left thinking there might have been a section where you lose everything for a little bit. That, or it's a blank slate for the showcase. Elizabeth then finds some Lincoln masks and puts one on. Now this might not seem important, but it is. The final game saw that characters like Lincoln were villainized because the founders liked slavery and anything that was white or looked like them. According to Ken Levine, in a commentary track for this footage, this sequence isn't set in stone.
One thing that a lot of people ask us about is, this sort of scripted versus non-scripted nature of the level. And there are parts of it, obviously, that are scripted, but it's interesting that the store, a lot of people thought that like Elizabeth, all the things to do with Elizabeth in the store were quite scripted and play out the same way every time, and actually that's not the case. Like in the store, we have this system where basically there are bits of business that Elizabeth or other characters can take on, and depending on what the player is doing, depending on how appropriate it is, depending if there's combat going on, Elizabeth may or may not, or other characters may or may not do those sequences. They just sort of like improvise. They have a library of things they can do, and they look to see around, is this a good time to do that?
If the character had taken another route through the story, you may not have seen the Lincoln mask at all. That may have been something that will show up at a later store or a later exploration.
And we have a system that sort of watches it and sees and looks for opportunities, basically. And we're going to talk more about that later, but I think it's when you watch a system at play and seeing Elizabeth just sort of reacting to you now, and
Yes.
we're sort of working through that. That has a million kinks, so we're working through all those kinks. That is really going to be a really interesting component of this game and make everybody's play experience feel quite different.
Yes, that's true.
That bit right there.
The camera peers over to a bunch of marionettes and it reminds me of the concept art of the Mad Toy Maker's place. We see early UI for both searching containers and the clothing system. Next segment is hiding from Songbird. There's a couple of things to take from this. First is that this is either a scripted section, the likely option, or Songbird was meant to be more of a threat or problem throughout the game. That he'd followed you around, sort of like Mr. X, or at least make it feel like the original RE2 Mr. X. The other interesting thing is Elizabeth's reaction to Songbird appearing. She's far more terrified than she ever is in the base game. Makes you wonder what the original story with the two of them is. In the release, it's far more of a guardian and child relationship. She clearly cares for Songbird but wants to be free. She never shows any real signs of being scared of Songbird specifically. Next up is an exchange that happens in the final game. It's the "don't let him take me back" conversation that happens in the latter half of the game. It seems to take place way earlier in the game on this version. After leaving the store, we see Elizabeth's powers are updated. She has the normal open tears ability with a completely different UI. We also see that there's 3 circles above the description text. Elizabeth would be able to open 1 of 3 tears, and based on dialogue later, she would have a bit of a cooldown on opening tears. More specifically, she mentions not being able to control her tears. This is also backed by developer commentary of this clip.
Sure. We really wanted to communicate that Liz only had moderate control of her powers, and one of the reasons they need to get to Comstock House is that Liz is losing control of her powers. It's getting incredibly dangerous for her to use them.
This whole idea is entirely gone in the final game. Now it's time for the infamous horse scene. The gist is Elizabeth sees a dead horse, opens a tear over it, and almost gets her and Booker killed. Now most of the scene doesn't exist in the final product. In fact, the only part that does is Elizabeth opening a tear to France. It's the same as when you first see her powers in the finished game. The reaction to Elizabeth's tear also suggests this takes place earlier on in the game.
Close it now! What was that? What was that? Talk to me, Elizabeth!
You were right. I can't control it. It's not possible.
Well, with what just happened, do you really want to take bets on what's possible?
The last part of the scene is the execution choice. Now, the final product has a couple of choice sections that don't actually impact anything, and I think that's most likely what is happening here. In the game files, though, we did find more choices that got cut. It's unsure if these would have led to other endings or just different cutscenes or items. There's specifically 4 in the game files. The first would be in the town center where you could talk to some civilians and lockpick a door. Oh, originally Booker was able to lockpick. The second is in Finkton. You could pick to either go to New York or France. This was likely later on in the game after Fitzroy's death. The third is actually later in the video that we'll see. The fourth is in the Sea of Lighthouses. You could decide if Booker pays off Comstock's debt or refuse to. The next segment, we see the effects of the Vox Revolution on the general populace. In early development, by the time Booker arrives in Colombia, the Civil War has already begun. The war would have been just between the Vox and the Founders, as opposed to Vox attacking anyone not in their faction. The Vox also wanted Elizabeth to use her powers for their own end. I wish some of the interactions that happened in this event were still in the game. It gives you time to see how the city is being affected by the war, and the dialogue here adds some more character to Booker and Elizabeth. We see some cool propaganda and walk into the third choice I mentioned. The choice is stopping an execution or just letting it happen. I assume letting it happen means you just move through the level faster. The footage stops the execution, leading into a fight. Interestingly enough, one of the men in the crowd points and screams, "It's DeWitt," meaning you've likely clashed with the Vox by this point. One of the Vox men goes to a giant machine nearby and proceeds to crank it. This is a cut tool that the Vox used to call in a blimp. I'm not going to comment much on the rest of the video, it's mostly just the fight with some background details here and there I'll mention in the next section of the video. The main things of note are the Skyhook looks like its final version. The enemies are way more vibrant in how they move and act during the fight.
It's alright. Don't worry.
I'm a little worried.
The design for the blimp is original. We see Elizabeth fighting off an attacker, which would never happen in the final game. They just ignore her there. The last moment of this section I want to talk about more. Both our heroes approach Comstock House. Take a listen to what they say here.
Is it really Comstock House? What if he won't help me?
I can be persuasive. You will get your freedom, and I get paid. Win-win.
Elizabeth mentions Comstock helping her, when in the release version, Comstock is the chief principal for keeping her in Columbia. Either they don't know this at the time of this footage, or Comstock's relationship with Elizabeth is different. The latter is further backed by Booker saying he'll get Comstock to give her freedom and for him to get paid. Elizabeth seems to be stuck in Columbia for different reasons as opposed to Comstock locking her away. Booker either means after they leave Columbia he gets paid, or someone in Comstock House is paying him for this job. It's probably the former though. Granted, Comstock could still be behind keeping Elizabeth in Columbia without either of our characters knowing. The last part of this footage is Songbird taking Elizabeth back, and it's shot for shot how it is in the release copy, except for Booker using the Skyrail. With that, all pre-release footage is shown. Now it's just little trailers here and there before the full game is released in 2013. We'll talk about those trailers and more in this section. Basically, it's everything else that didn't fit into the previous sections. Things like character designs or previous versions of current UI or systems. Let's start off with something more exciting, the heavy hitters. First up is the motorized Patriots.
You know, we wanted an AI that really expressed sort of the very sort of clear system of beliefs that founders have, and a heavy hitter that would sort of represent that. And the motorized Patriot is sort of the embodiment of that.
And they came up with this idea of this creepily motorized, like Hall of Presidents animatronic George Washington. It was specifically the face, specifically this weird, like, porcelain child dolls, you know, poor rendering of George Washington. That kind of clinched it.
Everybody saw it and said, okay, we can roll with that. It's one of those rare moments where you kind of all come together and you realize, okay, this is going to work. We're all on the same page here. Let's just move forward with what we got.
Before landing on the founding fathers of America, they played with the concept of the Patriots looking more like a businessman with a Gatling gun for a stomach. They even thought about making him a car. Once they moved over to Founding Fathers, there were plans to have a Jefferson version as well as all 4 base versions. I actually didn't realize there were 4 versions in the final game. I only actually remember facing the Washington version, but there's also the Franklin, Lincoln, and Comstock versions. I spent a bit confirming the Lincoln version was in the game because I genuinely don't remember ever seeing it. Under the mask, they thought about having a more damaged or corrupt look, but decided on the regular skull. Next up is the Boys of Silence. These guys have easily changed the most since initial concept.
Look, the Boys of Silence, I love them because they're just creepy. I mean, first time I saw it, I think it's rarely this happens where I just see a concept and I'm like, oh my God, we have to do that, we have to do that.
He was spec'd pretty early, and so the concept went in pretty early, and Ken fell in love with the concept instantly. Instantly, we all did. We all thought it was like the coolest thing we'd ever seen. I mean, anytime you completely obscure something's face, there's a creepiness that falls naturally out of wondering what's going on in there. You know, is it this hideously deformed child? Is there a head at all? You can only assume that it's horrible to be inside that mask, and yeah, I think that's where a lot of his scare value comes from.
So, you know, the way they work is that they're blind, they can't see you, but they can hear you. And the levels that you see them in, you have to make a decision on whether you're going to try to sneak around them or engage them directly. But if you anger them, they can call in backup.
Their purpose in the world is that they're sort of, I mean, think of the cameras from Bioshock 1, but think of them walking around and moving and looking for you. And I think he's going to be scary in the game and somebody the players are going to love to meet but also hate to meet.
The first plan for these enemies was to follow the players around and collect sounds they made. They would then attack you with those sounds. This idea was hard to convey and was confusing, and ended up getting scrapped for making the boys more like cameras. They'd be blind, but hear noises the player makes and then alert enemies. Oh, on a side note, stealth was initially more in the game design, but it got dropped. It's kind of funny talking about this, since the game has them only work with seeing the player and they're entirely stationary in a single segment of the final game. Oh, also before their final design, their ears looked more like horns. This is the section where I talk about the handyman, if I hadn't already talked about them before. The last heavy hitter is the siren.
So the siren is sort of our nod to a major social movement at the turn of the century, which was there was a sense of the spiritual world. I don't mean like you know, when you ask people are you religious? They say, no, I'm spiritual. No, I mean people actually were talking about, you know, contacting the dead and speaking to the dead.
The design for the siren began very early on, and when we were first looking at these sort of heavy hitter classes and these very special enemy classes.
So we started thinking about like the ghost of a performer that could be using her song to raise the dead. We started looking at the things that we could do with this kind of mystical, wavy and flowy type of woman who's floating around and raising people with her voice.
So the siren is an entity who's in contact with the other world and actually can bring Booker's enemies back to life to fight Booker once again. One of your challenges is going to be, who do I deal with? Do I deal with the siren? Because if I kill her, then all the enemies that she brought back to life will also return to their graves. Or do I deal with the guys who are actually shooting at me? And I think that's one of the sort of real tensions that you have in battle.
A ghost enemy that would revive the dead. The siren went from a special enemy you fight to becoming the Lady Comstock boss. That's it for the heavy hitters. Let's go through the rest of the enemies that didn't make the cut through the development. The closest to release was the Enhancer, a heavily clad enemy that would throw bottles at enemies to heal them or throw the bottles to hurt us. He actually had a full model before getting cut. Next is the Vigor Junkies. They'd be this game's version of Splicers. The Junkies would come in different forms depending on which vigor they particularly liked. The only trace of these enemies in the final game is a line at the fair about side effects of vigor.
Have you sampled any of the new vigors here today?
I usually wait till Fink works out the kinks with them. It's safer that way.
The Shock Jockey Vigor Junkies actually have a model in the game. The model got converted into the Frosty Splicer in Burial at Sea. There's concept art for a Colombian tank that didn't make it past this art. There's concept art for an automaton camera that would walk around and had claws to probably attack or defend. These guys likely got incorporated into the Boys of Silence. Fink had his own security to attack you along with Fink workers that were strapped to machines. Last but not least, early in development they thought about having little sisters. This likely got removed either before or after they felt the current project would be too close to Rapture in the Sky. I'm not actually sure if this is real, by the way. The art is by Jorge Lacera, hopefully I'm saying that right, and outside of the Bioshock wiki, I can't really find any proof of this concept. The only source in the wiki leads to the art book, but I didn't see any indication there. Next up is Vigors. We actually talked about some due to the previous footage, but let's talk about the rest. First up, Devil Kiss didn't have a trap. It would just create a big explosion around the player. Possession was called Mesmer. You can actually see an ad for it in the 2011 footage on the Skyrail. It was also far more flower-based, with a rose on the player's hand and the trap creating a flower that would release pheromones. Before we go a little deeper, let's look at some bottle concepts. We've got Bucking Bronco, Shock Jockey, Possession, Undertow, and Murder of Crows. There are two unused Vigor icons. One is of a beehive, likely meant to be the same as the plasmid in the first game. The other is the icon for Weapon Slave that we talked about back in the 2010 demo footage. There's also icons for unused Vigor upgrades in early versions of Gear, which leads me into Gear/miscellaneous. In this image, you can see an early design that looks like the gear for Fit as a Fiddle, some sort of grappling hook one, a parachute attached to a bottle, one showing the Skyhook's hook. Finally, there's a spring attached to a shoe. Speaking of that, there's concept art of spring shoes that the player would get. They also tossed around the idea of giving the player a jetpack. There was also a plan for this game's version of the Vita Chamber called the Respawn Tomb. It would bring the player back to life and you'd find them in multiplayer too. This ends up getting replaced for Elizabeth healing the player or Booker going through his office door. As mentioned in the previous section, at one point Booker would be able to use a hacking device on different machines. This idea lasted long enough into development for footage and even cut voice lines. Hacking likely got dropped and incorporated into possession. There are models for a vigor and weapon upgrade kit that you would use instead of just buying the upgrades at the vending machine. The Minuteman's armory also had a different design. There was a booth called the Mendelssohn Kinematic Couture, hopefully I said that right. It would function like the first game's gene bank. The player would be able to buy and switch out clothing gear. You can actually see this design in game when you're in Shantytown. Now let's take a mini break to look at some old GUIs. We've got two old HUDs. The first is further back in development, while the second one is closer to the final design. Next is an early version of the menu. We've got some design from the Spec Ops mode, a lobby screen, two different designs for a loadout screen, specifically a Vigor loadout screen, and a pop-up when you get XP, an interface from the Mendelssohn Kinematic Couture, an earlier version of the Minuteman Armory's purchase screen, a prototype menu for vending machines, and finally, an early loading screen. Lastly, we have three cut areas, all of which are lighthouses we'd likely see at the Sea of Lighthouses level. The first is a space level, likely a reference to System Shock. Next up is a desert lighthouse. And finally, a snowy lighthouse. All of these at the time were likely meant to help illustrate the multiverse angle. We can make a connection to the Snow Lighthouse with the rumors about Bioshock 4. Along with a screenshot that got leaked, the plot is rumored to take place in an Arctic city called Borealis. Next up is characters. We've already gone through the early gameplay designs of Elizabeth, but here's some outfit concepts. Now, I have zero actual experience in fashion or clothing design, so I'm just going to repeat some of the messages in the art book. When it came to her attire, they wanted to convey her lifetime in captivity. They explored choker designs and more princess-like attire for her. While figuring the character out, they also tried different ages, looks, and demeanors. When it came to her face, they wanted a more cartoonish style to help convey emotion even in the heat of battle. We got some cool action shots to help visualize her power for animators and effects designers. Lastly, we have some shots of Elizabeth as a kid. For Booker, they wanted to convey his gruff personality, from looking like a Wild West bounty hunter to more of an everyman that's in the final game. After trying different ages, demeanors, and expressions, they found a look that required slight tweaking to bring Booker to life. For the Founders, they tried different outfits, but more importantly, they had some awesome military designs. Just look at the details of some of these designs. They're so cool. We see some design for Cornelius Slate's men that didn't make it into the final game. Lastly, we arrive at the Vox. Daisy Fitzroy's outfit was meant to inspire charisma, power, and fanaticism while being inspired by real-world radical leaders. The designers wanted the Vox's weapons to look makeshift and thrown together. Now we wind down to the year 2012. The game is a year off from release, and it's not in a good shape. Here, most things were cut and the final game was made shape. With a year away from release and no more delays, the team was in no way close to launching a game. Ken Levine brings on Jordan Thomas, the creative director for Bioshock 2. Thomas was trusted to come on and help focus development by removing what wasn't necessary. Enough was cut that some devs say could make 5 or 6 games. While production started getting back on track, Ken Levine hired Rod Ferguson. Ferguson helped provide dates and deadlines to make sure work was actually done. This did lead to some immense crunch work for the next year. Hey everybody. At this point in the video, you might be wondering to yourself, so how did we get to this point where there's so much content that sort of didn't work and we needed to even call in a couple people like from outside to be able to sort of shape these pieces together? Luckily, I've got an article for you guys. So this is called The Final Years of Irrational Games, according to those who were there, by Chris Planty on the Polygon website. We're not going to go through all of it. It's a really good article, sort of about the lead up into Bioshock Infinite and then sort of afterwards making the DLC and then the closure. We're just going to go over a little bit of the front part of it. Not a big fan of just reading off of articles, but I don't really want to try and paraphrase this at all. Coming off Bioshock, Levine and the studio wanted to create something even more spectacular, memorable, and important. And they had the time. While the studio had had a good deal of creative freedom before, thanks to publisher 2K Games' history of providing plenty of leeway for its creators, as documented in our profile of 2K Marin. I guess that's their thing. Irrational had additional resources and time to create whatever would come next. Money and time weren't a concern for production in the first few years. The studio had an unusual surplus of creative freedom, which, sources say, inadvertently stymied its ability to track budgets and maintain schedules. So, essentially, when they were tasked with making another game, they were just allowed to do whatever they want for as long as they want. And that's sort of also been the case since they closed the 2K or Irrational Games, and then Ken Levine made Ghost Story. I think that was back in 2014, and they've been working on Judas, their new game, for 8 years. It got announced 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half. And from what I can tell, it sort of had similar production to how this one was. I'll go into it a bit more as we go. Let's see, they're talking about the multiplayer. At this point, according to sources, the single-player campaign was still in an experimental phase, and Levine was growing impatient with its progress. These early years of development were fueled by Levine's iterative process, a feverish ability to think, create, edit, trash, and rethink ideas in search of the best possible result. It's an intensive polishing process, says sources. The method had proven results. Sources described their former boss as someone with an ability to polish a mid-level game into a high-level one. Someone who knew what critics and shooter fans wanted and could finagle a way to please both parties. But where Levine had other projects taking his time during the development of the original Bioshock, his attention was singular for this follow-up project, Bioshock Infinite. Interviews pointed to Levine's eagerness to iterate as his most brilliant and most frustrating quality. It's an expensive and time-consuming creative method, but at its best, it could produce astonishing results. Former employees say it sometimes brought people to the company, other times drove them away. One source recalls how Levine would challenge the historical accuracy of a design down to the tiniest details. If something wasn't perfect, if it didn't fit in the context of the world, then it needed to be done again. I realize that he's not someone you bullshit, says the source, because he cares about that detail so much and really loves it when other people do too. The process resulted in stacks of incredible work, including things like the Skyline, a death-defying method of in-game transportation that would be praised upon the game's release. That process, however, meant every aspect of the game, including its fundamental tenets, could be reworked over and over to a point that entire chunks of Infinite's design had yet to be locked years into development. And I think that's probably where this idea of so much cut content comes from. They might have an idea, they'll start working on it, and then Ken might decide it just doesn't work anymore with his sort of vision, or other pieces have sort of come in together, and then he feels this just doesn't work. And from what I can tell, this was also similar to how Judas ended up being, and that's probably why it took so long to get to this point. Thomas and Levine decided multiplayer was impractical, so at this point he started bringing on Jordan Thomas. Plus the single-player mode still lacked a robust combat system, the modes were dropped and the teams were brought on to single-player production, where the combat experience could be applied. Many sources shared an enormous appreciation for Thomas's impact on Infinite. In the words of one employee, Jordan was a revelation. No one worked harder, no one worked more hours, he treated everyone with respect. Sources say Thomas and Levine shared similar visions and that Thomas helped to realize them. Thomas is described as someone who could take the many ideas and projects in progress and organize them into one vision. And I think that at its core is probably the biggest sort of identifier of the problem with Infinite, and then probably ends up Judas, if we ever learn more about that game's development. It seems like there was clear ideas on what was wanted, but there wasn't somebody who could step in, say yes, no, hard deadlines, this is good enough. I think not having somebody with that really sort of slows down production, and it causes a lot of things to get sort of cut. In August 2012, Rod Ferguson was hired as Vice President of Development. Levine had been introduced to Ferguson, who shipped the billion-dollar Gears of War series at Epic Games, through a friend. Sources say it was Levine himself who hired Ferguson to help the company ship Infinite. With Fergus on board, Tim Gerritsen, the director of product development, exited the production process. A month later, he left the studio, returning to Human Head Games. Many former employees believe Irrational would not have shipped Bioshock Infinite without Ferguson. As one source puts it, Rod insulated the team but also earned Ken's trust and didn't interfere with Ken's creative vision. As VP of Development, Ferguson served as the practical, metrics-minded foil to Levine's creative method. And according to sources, Levine benefited from the structure and deadlines. There you go. Needed some... He can be the creative head, but he needs somebody to sort of wrangle in, and honestly, without, structure and especially deadlines, things will just continue getting worked over and over, which seems to be what happened. If Thomas drew the map, then Ferguson established the final destination. Every day, he sent the team a bug count and a list of actionable items, then he'd meet with leads and directors in what a source calls the shit chamber, a place where senior employees could get together and share information face to face. Rod was there to turn on the lights and to turn them off. Hopefully that gives a little bit more idea into sort of how the state of the game was in such a bad way by actually a year from release. Anyway, back to the video. Bioshock Infinite released on March 26, 2013 to critical acclaim and is widely considered a cornerstone of the 7th generation of video games. While there's still more cut ideas or content to talk about, they're mostly little things like cut shops or propaganda. If you're curious to see them, the art book is available online or as a physical book if you prefer those. Now, let's talk about the thing I mentioned at the beginning. Neither the 2010 or 2011 versions were capable of being full games. They were simply too ambitious for hardware at the time. Developers working on the game said the exact same thing. The interesting thing was that the game reflected in that demo is not the game that we ultimately shipped, said level designer Sean Elliott. What the demo provided for Irrational was an opportunity to crystallize what they wanted to build with Bioshock Infinite. There were tentpoles in place already, but as had been reported in the past, it took a long time for Bioshock Infinite to begin coalescing. For Elliott and the rest of the team, an E3 demo was an opportunity to prove the vision to themselves and players. Just about everything in that demo was highly scripted. In other words, while someone was technically playing the game, they weren't doing any improvising. They wanted to show off the game in a very specific way. Plus, at that point in development, that was the only option. AI, artificial intelligence, for instance, was just atrocious, he said. It was ungodly, unbelievably bad at that point in time. If you just let them loose, it would have been catastrophic. Scripting becomes a form of development duct tape, a phrase that was uttered to me several times by various game makers during my reporting for the story. For Bioshock Infinite, the scripting was incredibly specific, down to when enemies fired a gun. If we were going to show the game at that state, for it to make any kind of good showing, we really needed to do scripting, said Elliott. It would have been far more misleading to have the AIs doing what they're naturally doing in that circumstance because, of course, we were going to improve that inevitably. But Elliott admitted the studio struggled to convey their ambition without promising a game they couldn't deliver. While he's proud of the demo, it's almost like a piece of cinema, he admits it represented a version of the game that was slightly more idealistic. All that we legitimately hoped to deliver on, he said. When E3 was over, Irrational tried to get the demo running on consoles. Until then, most development had taken place on high-end PCs that could handle everything being dreamed up. The final game, however, had to ship on the rapidly aging PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Due to memory constraints, it was like, uh-oh, laughed Elliott. This is not gonna happen. Now, I'm not a big fan of copying so much from an article, but I couldn't paraphrase this. While this article refers to the 2011 demo, I have no doubt it also works for the 2010 one. This was a case of development being too spread and needing something to point to and say that's what we are making. The same story happened with Anthem and I'm sure plenty of other games. Aside from this, it's another case of flying too close to the sun. Don't mourn for this version of the game, as it never truly existed.
You can picture happy gatherings round the fireside long ago. And you think of tearful partings when they left you here below. Will the circle be unbroken by and by? By and by is a better home awaiting in the sky, in the sky.